pase, pierna derecha, directo al arco, ¡golazo! ¡Golazo!
The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Good day, good night, and welcome to Soccer Today with Duane Rollins and myself, Kevin Laramee, joining us today on the line to talk about the Champions League last night in Toronto. James Grossi. James, good morning. Apparently we both missed both Duane and James right now. We're going to get him back on the line in a second. But it was a difficult first game for Toronto, and it was a difficult first minute for Toronto last night. As soon as we have James and Duane back on the line, which we have right now. So, gentlemen, last night, Duane, it was a tough beginning of the game. Let's just put it that way.
It certainly was a tough beginning to the game. 2 minutes into the game, and all of a sudden you're already behind. Greg Vanney said as much in a very sort of succinct press conference that you'll hear on Sober Second Thoughts a little later today once I piece it together. Getting out of there.
Sorry about that, guys.
No worries. It's that's what happens. I think it's the remnants of the Sky Dome roof that broke that actually disconnected us too. So.
I don't think anybody from Montreal should be saying anything about anybody's stadium roofs.
Yeah, fine. Thanks, James. But James,
I just had a Moxie Frubis song pop in my head, which is completely inappropriate. But something washing the turf at Skydome or something, fixing the roof at Skydome. Anyway,
yeah, that's James.
Grossi.
How was your experience last night? First of all, let's talk about pregame. Let's talk about before the kickoff, where just took about 90 seconds and there was a goal for America for Chivas. What was your thought before the beginning of the game, James?
It was a bit of a strange night. You know, nobody can really prepare for what the weather's been like this past few days. And I think that sort of took away from the atmosphere of the game, just in the sense that, you know, nobody was really nobody was quite prepared. You know, everyone was excited. There were large crowds heading down to the stadium, but it just didn't feel as lively as you would want it to feel before a huge match like that. You know, some of the hardcore Toronto supporters were gathered at the entrance where the visiting team comes in, and they had their flares and they had their chants. So there was definitely a good vibe around the stadium, but something felt just a little bit off about a late April game in a freezing cold situation down by the lake here.
Yeah, and the late kickoff doesn't help as well. When you start, that's CONCACAF because of the Champions League time and because of Mexico as well. They want to have both legs at around the same time, and having the kickoff at 8:30 p.m. in what should be a nice spring evening, but still is the 107th of January instead. So it was a bit freezing. Now, the lineup of this game. We do know there was some injuries on Toronto, and we'll talk about this a bit later on when Duane will mention he saw Vasquez last night, and he saw how Vasquez is last night, and he'll talk about this. But when you're looking at the starting 11 that was put forward by Greg Vanney, was it what you expected? Did you expect it maybe more? Like, there's only so much you could do having this group of players that are mostly healthy, but you have a few scratch here and there. Was that, for you, James, a hindrance for Toronto last night, the few injuries that are still present?
You know, Vanny's been keeping us on our toes all season. Anytime I think he's going to go with a 4-4-2, he ends up dropping in the three-man back line. And anytime I think he's going to go with that back three, he ends up putting a four in. So we weren't quite sure what exactly he was going to put out there. It may have been a risk to put Mavinga back in the lineup so quickly. You know, he's been out a couple of weeks, and he ended up having to be subbed at halftime with some cramping. So Toronto ended up burning a sub, you know, a little bit earlier than they may have wanted to, and you end up having one less chance to change things from your bench later on. So that was probably a bit of a risk, and if Vanny could do it over again, would he do differently? You know, that's for him to say. I was sort of wondering if he might get a little bit cute, and given how many players were on yellow cards, if Josie was dealing with the foot injury and was clearly unwell with a stomach bug last night, would it have made some sense to maybe put somebody like Toussaint out there or put Jordan Hamilton out there just to make sure you have at least one of your striking duo down for Mexico? Now, of course, that would have been an explosive decision, and it would have been he would have opened himself up for some massive criticism if things hadn't gone well in that case. But there were a bunch of questions, but this has been a really tough start to the year. Teams generally like to get some matches under their belt and build a rhythm through this part of the season, and his league schedule has been fairly light. Last night was the 11th match that the side has played this season, and 11 matches in a little under 2 months right at the start of the year after a very short off season. You're going to pick up a lot of bumps and nicks along the way. So there was definitely some wear and tear on the guys, but I don't think Benny, he put the lineup out there that he thought was going to give him the best chance to win. And, were it not for a bounce here and a refereeing decision there, it might have been a very different result.
James, I want to continue on that vein. And I was almost going to ask Coach Vanny this last night, but then I realized I would have just got the cliche answer back if I'd asked him anyway. But how much of this, of the struggles last night, and they did look a little flat to me at times, particularly off the start, obviously, can be attributed to the fact that they are beat up, that this is not a healthy team right now? And do you think that played a significant role or just a minor role?
I'd say it played a minor role in the grand scheme of things, but little things like that can have such a massive importance when you have two teams that are, scrapping for every inch of turf out there. And, having to play guys like Ashton Morgan or Drew Moore in Colorado on the weekend is just, it's a hassle that you didn't really need to deal with when you wanted to focus all your attention on such a huge occasion as this. And along with the injuries and sort of that general wear and tear, I really think the yellow cards played a factor last night too. I think there was a hesitancy in terms of not only confronting the ball, but sort of just getting in the way of Chivas, especially early when you're not quite sure how the referee is going to approach the match and how ready he's going to be to pull out that yellow card. Something I've noticed over the past few matches, and Michael Bradley's been sitting on that yellow since the first leg against Colorado some 7 matches ago, was, Michael would take a second or two just to have a quick word with the referee and remind them that he is on a yellow card. So I think between just that extra little bit of heaviness in the legs and having those yellow cards, and it has to be said as well, I know the grounds crew down at BMO Field does a massive amount of work to get the pitch ready, but playing on a heavy surface like that, playing on the turf at the Big O in Montreal, playing over in Colorado, they've been on so many different surfaces that when your body's still building up your fitness for a long season, all those sort of little factors have a definite role.
Yeah, fair enough. I call my post-game show, which will come out later this afternoon, Sober Second Thoughts. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to go sober second thoughts on this. When people were leaving that stadium last night, I got a sense of doom and gloom that this is over. The second goal killed it. We can talk about the second goal in a minute there. A bit of a keeping error, I think, and Vanny said as much. But now that we're 12 hours removed from the end of this game, how bad is it? Is this can they turn this around, or is a two-goal win in Mexico maybe a step too much to ask?
It would be, given the history of MLS teams in this competition, it would be really easy to sort of look at this as a real missed opportunity. But what struck me, speaking with a couple of the players last night, and Greg Vanny was a little bit terse in his post-match press conference, which is a little bit strange. He's usually pretty forthcoming when it comes to talking about a result. But between Michael Bradley and Drew Moore and Alex Bono, nobody's head was down about this result. Nobody had looked at it as a wasted opportunity or something that had slipped by them. Bradley was very insistent that, this is halftime in the series. That's something that Chivas' coach, Matias Almeida, mentioned as well. He wasn't ready to celebrate. He was asked a question about the Club World Cup, and he just dismissed it and was like, we're not even close to talking about that right now. So for Toronto FC, they've made the task more difficult. There's no two ways about that. Chivas are a very good defensive team, and going and trying to get a result in Mexico is a daunting task. You know, Toronto's never won there, and MLS clubs have a terrible history down there. But it struck me that none of the players were hanging their heads or feeling sorry for themselves. And I can't help but feel that after this 2 months of sort of uncertainty and never knowing where you're going to be from week to week, and I remember talking to Robin Fraser a couple of weeks ago when they finally got a 5-6 day break, and he was saying that he was looking forward to just knowing what day it was. You know, they had been traveling all over the place, been in so many different time zones that he only ever knew how many days it was since the last game and how many days it was till the next game. And with the result last night and with 90 minutes left in this series, there's a clarity that the team has that I don't think they've had in the last couple of weeks, in terms of they know exactly what they have to do when they go down to Chivas. They need to go down there and they need to win the game. They need to score 2 away goals in order to eliminate Chivas' advantage. And that's the sort of clarity that a team that's as focused and as driven as this one can really thrive on. And so it's a big ask and it's a difficult task, but you know, if any MLS side could do it, this is probably the one.
One comment from Michael Bradley that was a bit left in the cold last night. Not a lot of people are talking about it this morning, and really got me thinking. He was talking about Chivas and how not tactical they were. It's like they're not a tactical team. The way they pressure is literally just overlapping each other, man towards the ball and going forward movement, and with their technique and abilities on the ball, able to either create space or create an opportunity, which we saw with the first goal. I was impressed by this type of comment from Michael Bradley, because we forget sometimes how Michael Bradley sees this game and analyzes in real time and is able to pick up things here and there. You mentioned the yellow card and how he's been on a yellow card since game number 1 of the knockout stage. He had conversations all game long, and especially before the game, with the referee saying, you know, guys, I'm on a yellow, right? So if you can just not give me a yellow, I'll really appreciate it. My question for you, James, is this. With now Toronto having faced 3 Mexican teams in a row, and I would say the qualities of those 3 went from the best in the Mexican League, second best, and now not even in that conversation, but the way Chivas is playing is not as predictable, is not as, you cannot analyze chaos and trying to determine how to play and to find a counter punch to that attack. When you look at Chivas last night, is there a way you see to break them down, or is their unpredictability almost a strength?
In this age of modern football, where systems and tactics have really come to the front, and teams are really well drilled, and they analyze each other for strengths and weaknesses and ways to get an advantage in the match. Having a team that's a little bit old school like Chivas, where as you said, it's more of an individual sort of spur of the moment type of game. It's more about, like, when I look back at last night's match, I was struck by how both their goals sort of came from scrappy, broken plays. They weren't well designed. They weren't from periods of pressure. They weren't from 20 pass completions that put together and made a chance. First one was from a scrappy throw in, and the second one was a free kick that sailed on Alex Bono and found its way into the back of the net. So for a team like Toronto that puts in all that work of scouting an opponent, that does make it challenging, in the sense that you can't draw up a plan that will exploit the other team's weakness. I think what it comes down to, and we saw elements of this last night, was that when Toronto was able to play quickly the way that they wanted to play, and then they were able to get the ball moving, and when they were able to link up with each other, they carved Chivas open. From about the 30th minute on, they had 2 or 3 chances that they really should have capitalized upon. And I think that'll be key going into the second leg, will be Toronto finding times where they can make the game shaped the way that they want it to be, and they can up the tempo, and they can expose Chivas's desire to focus so intently on man marking, which is another thing that Vanny talks about last night. And when you get that close to players, you can get dragged out of position and you can leave all kinds of space. Up in the press box, we were sort of talking about how much territory there was between Toronto's front line and the midfield for the first 20 minutes of that game. And there was about 40 yards in between where the defenders were keeping an eye on Josie Altidore and Sebastian Jovinko, and where Marky Delgado and Jonathan Osorio were sort of patrolling and looking to get on the ball. And when you leave that much unprotected space for a team like Toronto to run into, we saw how devastating it could be last night when Michael Bradley got forward, or when Delgado got forward and really picked that space. And, if Justin Morrow's back to fitness, Ashton Morgan didn't look as good last match as he has in previous matches, and Alro looked a little bit off with some of his passing and some of his decision-making. But when you have that many runners that are willing to get into that space and exploit it, if Toronto can up the tempo and move Chivas around and find those lanes, then I think they could do some damage in the second leg.
Now, you mentioned the free kick goal, and you mentioned the first goal too. I don't want to say the easiest goal that Bono conceded, but he wasn't as efficient on those two plays as he has been since the beginning of this tournament. I'll be nice and I'll put it this way. What do you think needs to change for next game? Can anything change? Is it just happenstances? Oh, there was the win in the south end and it floated a bit and found the top corner? Or should some of his play be maybe rewatched and get ready for the second leg?
Knowing what I know about Alex and John Conway, the goalkeeping coach, and Clint Irwin, who plays a vital role for the side as the backup keeper behind the scenes, they will definitely be studying what happened last night, especially on that free kick goal. We were having a bit of a debate in the press conference room about what exactly happened. BMO Field being right on Lake Ontario, it's not peculiar for some winds to kick up. I remember a Nick LaBrocca assisted goal. You remember that one, Duane?
I was right in front of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it picked up speed as it approached goal, and the winds that whip off that lake, especially on a cold day like that, can be devastating for a keeper. So if you sort of look at that flight of that ball, it's not so much that it picked up speed as it was going in, but it was deceptive in the way that there was a weird dip to it, and the way that it bent, there was a whipping, dipping sort of element to it. And, Alex is a very aggressive keeper, and it's something that Toronto and Conway in particular really like from their goalkeepers. They want the keeper to clean up whatever he can take care of and not risk that ball falling in the box. And it looked like Alex just took one little step too much and got himself caught underneath the peculiar sail of that ball. And he's a young keeper. He's made mistakes before, and he's managed to put them behind him. And I don't think you sort of have to look at all the good that he's done for this team, including standing on his head against Club America at Azteca in the last round. And, mistakes happen, but you win as a team and you lose as a team. And that's something that Michael Bradley and Drew Moore both sort of emphasized last night.
You mentioned Greg Vanney's post-game comments were a little terser than normal, which, it's all a fine line. If you don't hear him week in, week out, you wouldn't quite pick up on it, because even when he's kind of angry, he doesn't seem that angry. Do you think he was angry about something specific? Like, do you think that they didn't execute a game plan that he had in mind, or was that just the stress of the moment in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. We'd have to talk to him a little bit more, but Greg's generally very generous with his time with the media, and he speaks well about the game. The old cliche of a student of the game is sort of something that people mock, but he's somebody who really takes the time to explain his thoughts and how he saw things play out. And it's been a difficult couple of months in terms of the amount of work that Greg and his staff have had to put in over this time, preparing for opponents, traveling, all of that sort of stuff that we talked about earlier. And so I feel like last night was just, you get a lot of the same questions over and over again in these situations. And I think if Greg had wanted to sum that game up, he would have just said that we didn't come out and do what we had to do. And you can only give that answer to so many questions before it becomes pointless. And I'm sure we'll get some better explanations this week in terms of where he felt things went wrong. But as a coach, to see your side play in this huge match and sort of fall asleep from a throw-in 60 seconds in is just, it's devastating to a coach that prides himself on having his team ready and having them, prepared for everything that's going to come at them. And then that second goal, it changes the complexion of the series in the sense that not only have you lost this match, but 2 away goals is a pretty big factor. Now, as I said, Toronto now knows exactly what they have to do, so there's no question marks heading into the second leg. But I think Vinny would be disappointed with how it played out, but he'll quickly put that behind him.
We'll wrap with... Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
I was going to just mention one thing. We have to give credit to Chivas as well. And I have to say, Matias Almeida, the manager of Chivas since 2015, former Argentine player, nicknamed El Pelado, which means the bald one for a guy that has hair up to his shoulders, is a bit interesting. But Matias Almeida's game plan, which we talked about it for a second, that chaos, that unpredictability, have to say, it hasn't worked a lot in the past for Chivas since 2015, since Almeida's been the coach. But against a Toronto side that was maybe expecting more organization, more, I have to say, I have to give credit to Matias Almeida and how he managed his group last night, the day before, and managed through the weather, managed the excitement level, anticipation level of his players, and find ways to get things done in what we could say a rainy night in Stoke. All right, it's our version of a cold night in Stoke. It's a wet, damp, and freezing night at BMO Field next to the lake. It was a great performance by Matias Almeida's team.
Yeah, I've been very impressed by the figure he's cut in terms of how he's approached this series and how he's given Toronto the respect that they deserved for getting to this point and for beating the 2 teams that they did to get here. At his pre-match press conference up at the BMO training grounds on Monday, there was a quiet confidence about him, but it wasn't the sort of overconfidence that we got from Miguel Herrera, who was busy, spinning his webs and downplaying MLS and stirring up controversy and doing all those things that he does. Almeida came in saying all the right things in terms of, we respect the opponent. He thought that the 2 best teams had gotten to this point. He expected a difficult game with a Toronto side that had found a style and that had found so much success over the last couple of years. And then in his comments last night, he refused to celebrate. He was asked directly about, do they, sort of paraphrasing the question, do they feel like they have one foot in the Club World Cup? Are they looking forward to that? Is that sort of a reward for the difficult couple of years that he's had at Chivas? And he basically dismissed that question out of hand and just reiterated what he had said, that, there's 90 minutes left. We're halftime in the series, and that Chivas under him are a side that treats the game with respect and approaches every game with humility. And I think that's something that we saw last night. They came into Toronto and, they punched them in the nose with that early goal. They got the second goal, but competed for every inch of grass last night. And, they got the rewards for that.
All right, James, we'll wrap with this one. I hesitate to focus on the league too much, but they are 1-3, staring 1-4 straight in the face. If this does not go their way next week, and certainly the challenges are out there, how much of an emotional hit will that be on this team, and how much of a hole will they have dug themselves? Because the East is very competitive, and as much as we like to say they can flip a switch and make the playoffs and go from there, when you start looking at that, the way that Atlanta and New York's playing, the Red Bulls are playing well, Columbus is playing well, at some point this starts to become worrisome. If they lose this, how worried should TFC fans be that this season might continue to spiral in a way that they don't like?
I think it's been a little bit fortunate that the last match was against Colorado and this next one's against Houston, in the sense that you can sort of afford to give away some points to the Western Conference without it necessarily impacting your standing in the Eastern Conference table. You never want to throw a game away, and you want to take what you can from every single one. But that's sort of a nice little cushion. In terms of the MLS season is long, and teams that start out bright tend to have dips at some point. And the Eastern Conference is looking very tough. As you said, Atlanta looks good. New York City FC looks good. Columbus looks pretty sharp as well. And, of course, there's the Red Bulls who nobody likes playing against. And I guess Montreal could turn it around at some point. It's possible. But this is a side that in the 3 seasons that I've been covering them closely, what's really stuck out to me is how they're able to put disappointments behind them. Now, of course, this would be a pretty massive disappointment, but one of the things that they told us after the defeat in the 2016 MLS Cup was that, the guys were back at training a few days later, getting ready to go on their Christmas holidays, and they were already talking about what they wanted to do next season. They don't dwell on defeats. This would be a particularly large one, and you can't help but think that it would impact them to some extent. But, that's one of the beauties of professional sports is there's always another season around the corner, and there's always a next match to focus on. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a little bit of a dip, but I doubt it'll play out on the field. I think it'll be more of a personal disappointment than it'll be on the pitch.
James, thank you very much for your time today. You can follow James on Twitter at Grossi, Grawsee. And we'll be right back with Duane and myself after this very short break.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at SoccerTodaySPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
Thanks to all our Patreons. Patreon.com/Sports Podcasting Network. $2 a month gives you access to our exclusive Canadian soccer show called the Two Solitude Soccer Podcast, where you can hear Duane Rollins, myself, Kevin Laramee, and Keaton Robbins talk about Canadian soccer and Canadian soccer only. And, of course, we're going to talk about the Canadian Premier League, and that will come out tomorrow during the day. Now, back with Duane Rollins. Duane, what is your thoughts on last night's result? Is it the end of hope? Is hope dead?
Well, no, because TFC is a good team, but you got to give a lot of credit to the way that Guadalajara came out and played that game. As James said, as Greg Vanny pointed out in his press comments after the game, they played a very simple man mark, a high press kind of situation. They were trying to take Toronto's width away for most of the evening. Toronto likes to get the fullbacks up into the play, as we well know. They were taking that away immediately. They were causing lots of problems. TFC's best spell came after Jonathan Rosario's goal for about 20 minutes there in the first half. They probably should have converted a couple opportunities the second half, although TFC did have most of the ball. I believe, I don't have the stats in front of me, but it was close to 60-40 in terms of percentage stats in the second half. Outside of that one little play where Javenko flicked it on to Jose Altidore, who blasted it short side and wasn't able to convert that opportunity. Outside of that, there wasn't a lot of great chances. Now, the goal against in the second half was a keeping error. There's no other way to put it. He took a step forward, got caught flat-footed, could not react in time to the flow of the ball. Yeah, the wind probably played a factor. As James said, I have seen some weird goals go in that end before because it is right off the lake, but in a Continental Championship game, you can't allow a goal like that, and they're going to protect him. He's a keeper. He's going to have to, his career's not close to done yet. He's going to have other errors in his career that he's going to have to overcome one, but this one's a pretty big one considering what time it happened and in what situation it happened. Is it over? No, but if I'm going to put one of my famous percentages on this, I'd say it's 90% likely that Chivas goes on to win this tie over TFC in the second leg. I'll give TFC a 10% chance, particularly if they can score in the first half and are just carrying, if they are able to go into the second half, up a goal, then maybe. But as James said, and we forget this because of the run they've had now, even though TFC has done well in Mexico, they failed to win either the game against Tigres, where they had the collapse in the last 5 minutes and almost ended up blowing the tie, 4-4 aggregate final, And against Club America, of course, they allowed that late penalty, which is why the second leg of this tie is in Guadalajara. So it's a big ask, but you know, and it's disappointing from a TFC perspective to lose this opportunity, because it is clear that Chivas, in terms of the talent level, is not at the same, but they're still a Liga MX team. They still have talent. They still probably are close to the equal of TFC talent-wise, and they had a better game plan on the day that they performed better, and you know, full credit to them for that.
No, and I have to say, I want to make sure that we give the credit for Chivas, because I was really surprised by how they executed their game plan. And yes, Matias Almeida's resume is impressive in Argentina and in Mexican football, but since 2015, let's just put it this way, Chivas has not been that strong. One of the team that was in the conversation for relegation if Liga MX did not put an embargo on relegation in the offseason that just finished a few weeks ago. So that being said, how Almeida's decided to, well, it's how Chivas is constructed from the bottom too. It's the just Mexican players aspect, how the players are shown to play, that it's not just about the collective. The collective is important. The tactics or how we play as a unit, as a cohesive unit is important. But on the one-on-ones, on the 1v1s, last night Chivas did not lose a lot of 1v1. And where we usually see Toronto have an advantage on one-on-ones because of their higher ceiling of talent that we've seen in Major League Soccer, it was difficult against America and Tigres, but the collective versus the Tigres and America collective were better. This doesn't apply against Chivas, because Chivas will find a way, if they had to put 10 guys on one side to find a way to break through, they will. And you know, the whatever it takes, the at all cost attitude that Chivas has in those type of environment, well, it paid off last night.
I think that, you know, a final thought on that is this. I think what Chivas has over Tigres, over America, is that they're willing to play this simple way without sort of there's almost an expectation, I think, with the bigger clubs in Mexico when they're playing an MLS team, that they're supposed to go out and dominate these games. And I think that particularly America bit them in the bum a little bit in terms of how they approached particularly the first leg, where they, rather than playing a more simplistic road approach to that, where they, you know, with the idea that they could protect Azteca, they went out and, you know, with bravado and tried to play in the face, and were burned by TFC in the second half, where they were able to get those 2 goals, and that third goal being so key to that tie. I think Chivas is able to play humbly, I'll say, in a way that allows them to be very effective. They are a tremendously good defensive team. They are able to perform the low block very well. They're able to play very disciplined. As I said, they play very simple man mark situation. It's old school in many ways, kind of like 90s soccer.
You mean with the baggy jerseys?
And that's
you mean
something
with
that TFC was confused by, I think.
Sorry, when you say 90s football, and I just see the big Umbro, like really 2 big kits in my mind. So like the really baggy kits. I'm like, oh yeah, those were cool. Where can I get one?
You need to go back to have those 90s keeper kits with the floral patterns and stuff like that. Go back to like that.
Rene Guita and the scorpion kick dressed. Oh, that was awesome. We're going to talk about this soon in World Cup today. But Duane, to finish the show today, before we just go quickly on the news, one thing that has to do with last night, but not to do with the match versus Chivas, is the health of Victor Vasquez. You saw Vasquez behind the scenes at BMO Field last night, and this is an update that will maybe give a bit of worries to some of TFC's fans, but let's just put it this way. How is Victor doing?
Well, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but he was wearing a boot cast, so you can draw your own conclusions there about his availability for next week. He's listed on the injured reserve right now, and I don't suspect he's back for a month or so too. It's a nerve issue. They're trying to restrict the mobility of that. It certainly did not look like he was close to ready. That's what I'll say. And, again, the caveat, I'm not a medical doctor. If I was a medical doctor, I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast right now, Kevin. No offense.
None taken at all. All right, Duane, before we say goodbye for today, we had a bit of a news. And, when we think about, we talked Cincinnati yesterday and how they may be the next expansion team in Major League Soccer. When you think about teams, what could the name be? Like, they're already FC Cincinnati, so Should we keep this? Should we maybe add some German history to it? Because, well, we all know that there's a lot of German history in Cincinnati, right?
Well, apparently there is, but yeah, they're going to rename the team Fußball Cincinnati, which is ridiculous, embarrassing, derivative, stupid name that they should be ashamed of for coming up, in my opinion. I am not fond of the Real Salt Lakes or the Sporting Kansas Cities, those names. They take history from elsewhere and they shove it into a box which it doesn't belong in. Yeah, I get that in 1810 there was a lot of German settlers in Cincinnati. It's not 1810 anymore, and this isn't a 200-year-old football club. It is a USL club that is 5 years old. It's a ridiculous name, and yeah, people may think that I'm overreacting to something like this. It's embarrassing to the league. Real Salt Lake is the most ridiculous name in the history of professional sport. Real is a royal declaration that was given by the Spanish king to these clubs back in the day. I don't think he gave it to Salt Lake City's Major League Soccer team. They just wanted to sound like they were Real Madrid. It's something you do on your kid's house league team. It is ridiculous and not something that should be happening in a professional league. Yeah, it actually does make me angry, these names. And you may seem to think that's frivolous, but
we'll see.
I hate them.
We'll see if it sticks. But I have a feeling that you're not the only one who feels this way. Maybe a lot of people in Cincinnati feels this way. And maybe by when
people in Cincinnati are pushing back on it because apparently they asked for it because they're being too cute by half. But at any rate, yeah.
Just keep the FC Cincinnati Football Club. That works. FC Cincinnati. Guess what? There's already logos, branding, and everything. People can keep their scarf. Or maybe that's why. If you change the name, if you change everything, people will have to buy new gear. So in year one, guess what? You have a lot of merchandise being sold.
All right, yes. There's doing a lot of good things to build that club, but this name is silly, to say the least. So let's hope that saner brains prevail. I will always tell this story, and I was ripping on Sporting Kansas City and their rebrand because, they're not from Lisbon. And the social media person who's no longer there at the Wizard at that time reached out to me. It was MLS Cup Final in 2010 and asked to meet me to talk about the name change. And I met him for a coffee down at the Harbor Castle here in Toronto, where all the MLS stuff was happening. And for an hour, he explained in glowing terms how this wasn't just them trying to emulate some European name to try and seem more authentic, but they were really going to develop a sporting club. There was going to be like a women's lacrosse team and like a rugby team and et cetera, et cetera. Well, here we are 8 years later, and there is no women's lacrosse team.
Where's the lacrosse team? I want to watch the Sporting Kansas City rugby match. I want to see that.
And in fact, they didn't even invest in the women's team that left Kansas City. So the idea that they were going to be a sporting club is patently absurd. And it speaks to this idea. They're just trying to put names that sound like they're from old and from Europe, and it's I hate them so much. It takes what is a great growing league and it puts this tarnish because people look at them from outside and go, "What the hell kind of league does this?" It's ridiculous.
Duane, I don't know about you, but in 2018, when I look at Washington D.C., it's all but United. DC as a whole is not united. Anyway, yeah, okay, that's maybe too much politics for today, and that's a sign that we need to wrap the show up for today. You can follow Duane on Twitter at 24th Minutes, myself at Kev Laramee. Thanks to all our brand new listeners, Mexican fans probably that are listening to us and yelling at their devices. You're welcome, and we'll be back tomorrow for another edition of Soccer Today. Myself at Kev Laramee, Duane at 24th Minutes. Live Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. at youtube.com/sports podcasting network. And as always, until tomorrow, have a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.